Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SIAS Corporate Governance Digital Symposium 2020. I'm Mark Lowdy. Thank you so much for joining us for the next 2 hours. If you were with us yesterday, you'll know that it's going to be an action-packed 2 hours with lots of frank exchanges of views and candid comments. Today, our focus is on corruption, and in particular, how to ensure that you, as the board, make sure that you ensure that the business integrity is intact and that you're fully up to all the corporate governance standards. The question we're asking and answering today is whether the board is doing enough. In a few moments, I'll introduce our speakers and panelists, but first a reminder too that we need you to be part of this conversation by interacting with us through the chat function at the bottom here of the Zoom screen. You can click on the Q&A function at any time. Please don't wait necessarily for our panel moderator to invite you. Come up with your questions as well as contributions. Maybe you'd even like to challenge our speakers at any time over the next 2 hours. Do so early so we can be sure to answer all of your questions and respond to as many points as possible. So the topic, as I mentioned, is very much about business integrity. And to start off, or kick us off on this particular topic, I'm pleased to introduce here in our digital symposium the Director of the Center of Governance, Institution and Organizations at NUS Business School, Professor Lawrence Loh. Good afternoon. Welcome to the show.
Yes, good afternoon, Mark. Yes.
Thank you for joining us. And you're going to be setting the tone for the next half hour with your presentation.
Yes, definitely. I think it is a very important tone. You can see I'm actually in my office right now. I have a background, but this is not Photoshop. It's a real background, and I think this relates to the topic business integrity. Yeah.
Right, indeed. No virtual backgrounds. Maybe I should drop my virtual background just to show how transparent we are, Professor Loh.
Yes, so I believe we are ready to rock and roll, as you say in the
Yes.
chat. Yeah. So can I do the sharing now and pull up some of my transparency, Mark and panelists and also members, participants? Can you all see me, hear me, and
yes,
also see the transparency in the presentation mode?
I believe we can, Professor Loh.
Yeah, so with your permission, Mark, can I begin?
Yes, you have official permission. The countdown has already reached 0. Over to you.
Okay, good. I will make it short, and definitely there's no injury time. I think this is going to be action-packed. Good afternoon, all my friends coming to this SIAS Digital Symposium. I'm very happy to be coming here actually from the university. I'm in Cambridge now. I've been actually going to the office here, my office since July. Since July I'm in here every day, including weekend. The students are all showing up at the door, but occasionally, it's very good to be, having a Zoom session. In fact, I have been literally in the last few months, literally becoming a zombie, zooming in and out of conferences. But today I think it's zooming for a very, very good cause, because this is something important, and also I'm quite passionate about it, and all the more because we have this partnership that my research center, SIAS-CGIO, have with SIAS, and also together with another institution, ASEAN CSR Network, which I'll talk about. I will actually share with you some insights and, more importantly, some findings on a real study that we have on business integrity. So for today, if I can immediately start, it's going to be half a dozen of issues in my short set the stage for the in-depth panel. I believe we have a very, very strong panel of speakers in the panel. So I won't steal the thunder from them, but to actually lay the groundwork for some of the issues, perhaps even not providing the answers, but actually to look at the state of play. So I'm going to look at first the broader picture of evidence-based research done at perhaps at my university here in my research center, and then zooming on to corporate governance in itself with a very heavy dosage of investor perspective, and then I look at what is missing right now in evidence-based research, and then zoom in. The meat of today, after all, the appetizer would be actually a business integrity study in ASEAN corporations. I will talk about this, and then look at some of the implications, particularly now when we have this ongoing pandemic. We don't know when it will end, but already many issues relating to integrity surfaces in many corporations. And then, of course, the punchline is one piece of research that we have done to look at this relationship. So without much further ado, let me just paint a broader picture. The broader picture is we have been looking at corporate governance, and right now, at least in the Singapore scene, in the Singapore backdrop, what my research center, in fact myself as one of the principal author of many research, is that we have established definitive relationship. If you can see the green ticks, these are the relationship that has been already established as far as scholarly research is concerned on the Singapore setting. We have found, first of all, corporate governance is positively related to firm performance. Very interesting. In fact, as a determinant, we have found that board diversity, particularly gender diversity, is also linked to corporate governance. This link has been published. We also established that CG is related to sustainability reporting, and in itself, this is related to firm performance. And then just last month, we have this new study that link sustainability reporting to brand value of a company. But this is just evidence. Of course, corporate governance is much more complex than that, and there'll be a whole series, a whole spectrum of determinants, more than just diversity. But today, my focus is really to see what is corporate governance, and is there any other missing foundation? And to look at corporate governance, the highlighted box, what I have done is actually to invoke what SIAS has been doing in the past years, looking at excellence in corporate governance. And over the many years, SIAS has come out with the Investor Choice Award, very, very successful series of awards. One of the centerpieces is actually the SCGA, or the Singapore Corporate Governance Award. And this is something that we have been doing to recognize, to encourage, to motivate the ecosystem in crossing the frontier and uplifting the standards of corporate governance. So this is well and good, very, very good. We have over the years developed a SIAS-CGIO STARS framework. Maybe this is one of the best kept secret, because we have used this to assess companies for the ICA, the Investor's Choice Award. And if you can see, for very good reason, and also in line with the mission and purpose of SIAS, this framework give particular emphasis on investors, which are the shareholders. About 1/3 of the base weightage is on shareholder rights and equitable treatment. So we have this operationalization of corporate governance, well and good. So we will use this measurement for our study. But if you look at CG, is there something else? Is there something else that undergirds, that is the big rock of corporate governance, more than just what we found, diversity and many other factors that so far are present there, but we have not done the empirical research. Today we are going to unravel another piece which we believe will be one of the fundamental foundation, and this is something got to do with business integrity. And I think this sometimes is called anti-corruption, although whenever I hold events mentioning anti-corruption, nobody seems to show up. I know that about some years ago, I hold a seminar on anti-corruption, nobody show up. The next year I changed it to business integrity, everybody show up, because it's more positive, more uplifting. So today we are going to look at business integrity, which, as the moderator, as the MC say, is actually corruption, anti-corruption. And this is something that has a lot of definitions, but today we are probably not going to look at the academic definition and treatise on business integrity, but just to highlight one common definition is business integrity is what you do when no one is watching. So you know, in the Zoom environment, work from home, no one is watching. Are you actually working? You know, these are all small issues in business integrity, but of course there are bigger issues too at the level of corporation that we'll look at. So we'll look at this link in particular, and we have done a study in ASEAN corporations to look at that. But as a way of background, before I even highlight certain aspects of the study, let me just give one background. I believe this background is quite important, not so much because of the findings, but because of the contrast of the differences with our results. So I need to show this. This relates to, I believe some of you have seen this every year, usually in January. There's an organization called Transparency International would release this study called the CPI, Corruption Perception Index. This is a study that encompasses, let me see, 180 countries usually. And this Transparency International is NGO that is based in Berlin, Germany, and their mission and their purpose is actually to promote our understanding, in fact, by doing research in corruption, and they are called themselves transparency because transparency is one of the key facets of not being corrupt. So in this study, ASEAN in itself is, score average, not too high, not too low, about average as all the rest of the country. But of course, if you look at ASEAN countries in particular, what is more revealing, and I think this is probably something we want to take note of, if you look at some of the score is of course 100 is the best, 0 is the worst. There seems to be a variance. If you translate the score to rank, it is even more revealing. There seems to be a general trend of quite high ranks. A high rank means not so good, and there seems to be an outlier. Singapore is an outlier, a positive outlier over the years. Usually it's single digit ranking, and the rest of the ASEAN countries, even if you look at Thailand, Philippines, they are double, even 3 digits, not even 2. Malaysia, Indonesia is somewhere from 50 to 85, and this is out of 180 countries they have ranked. TI has ranked, and they have actually got it from many data sources. TI does not do the primary survey by itself. They congregate the data, the findings from perceptive information used by 13 different data sources, and they are all very, I would say, respectable institutions, including some of the key think tanks in the world. They got all the data and they do an aggregation to get this. So having said that, this is something which we need to register for at least, make a mental imprint now on some of the ranking for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now let's look at our study that we have been doing. After the background, let's look at some of the things we do in corporation. The other study, CPI, was a national level study. This study that SIAS has commissioned together with collaborators CGIO and ASEAN CSR network. SIAS needs no introduction. My center is CGIO. What you can see me. What you see is what you get. And there's another organization, ASEAN CSR network, which is an organization that provides the ASEAN perspective to this whole study. The Chief Executive Officer, Thomas will be here as a panelist too. And with this study, what we have done is to actually benchmark. In fact, we use the methodology of Transparency International. And just by way of introduction, Transparency International, beside the CPI, they have done many other studies, other research. one of the key pieces of research is actually looking at anti-corruption in companies. So they have this program of studies. The initial study was in 2014. In fact, this is a definitive study. They have a methodology which we adopted for the study so that we can do the benchmarking. Of course, it's not difficult to compose our own study, but we deliberately, by design, by choice, use some of the aspects, some of the measurement of TI, so that we can actually see the respective performances of the country and also ASEAN as a collective with the findings of the study. TI has actually done three studies. I mean, I do not want to go into detail, but basically a study of global corporation, 100 of them. And then they have another study in 2015, which is a vertical market in telecoms industry. They also have a third study using the same methodology in beyond just global. They look at emerging markets in particular. So they have 3 studies on this, and we have done this study to benchmark ourselves with them. Later when we see the results, I will verbally mention some of the benchmark just by way of introduction. So the scope of our study today, basically we cover 5 ASEAN countries. The 5 usually mentioned, in Peninsular ASEAN, and also the island part, which is Indonesia and Philippines. We did not have the opportunity to do the CLMV together with Brunei, also because many of the companies are not that mature, and we also face certain linguistic issue. But we look at 50 largest by market cap. The market cap was defined in March, but I need to say something very clear here. It's not stated. The data were collected as of 30th June 2020, 30th June. So in other words, our study is, the data for our study is actually very, very up to date because we need 1 to 2 months to do the coding and do the analysis. So we cover up to 30th June, and I think this is important because as of up to June, we cover a large part of the pandemic as well, including some of the lockdowns in various countries. In Singapore, we call it circuit breaker. In some other countries, they call it control order. Whatever you call it is actually some kind of a restriction in movement to mitigate, to control the pandemic, I would say, spread. So this is something up to 30th June, and we took many data sources. Basically, this is another important point I have to say very explicitly here. These are all based on disclosure. As of just like in corporate governance, in sustainability, as investors, we do not have the opportunity to go into the company to have private data privy to some of the specific data that they do not publicize. So we put ourselves in the shoe like a bona fide investor. What kind of information do we get? So we get the full range of disclosed information to see how each company in the sample set of 250 companies in all together, because it's 50 times 5, we have a scoring scale, 1, 0.5, and 0, and then we look at 13 aspects of anti-corruption. Okay, this map is quite important. This table here, this is actually the core of the Transparency International framework. What we have done is to adopt the 13 aspects, but our value added is to organize them, categorize them better than TI without changing the spirit and the essence of the study. We have categorized them, grouped them under 3 boxes, 3 buckets, or call it 3 categories: internal, external, reporting, and monitoring. So take another imprint of this mentally for 5 seconds. There are 13 aspects. Internal means something that has got to do within the organization, the leadership, their, the board statement, or their public commitment to comply with laws, their training program, their code of ethics, or some they call it the code of conduct. Okay, so this is internal. External means, and this is something usually quite sensitive, whether their anti-corruption practices, policy, or code relates to external parties, including agents, including suppliers, and then the aspects will cover even give hospitality, travel, whether they have facilitation payment, which means bribe. So I think, and also in some countries, this is quite important, political contribution, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia. In agents, for example, agents and supplier are actually where most of the problem are. I think most of you probably recall, even in Singapore, you know, the well-known case, which is heavily publicized in the media some years back, in the Keppel Corporation. It was actually done, you know, the ad was done through agents. So it's something quite important. But of course, having mentioned Keppel, I should actually explicitly say that many, in fact, I think almost all the issues were rectified. So I think it's good for them to actually continue. And of course, reporting is very important. Whistleblowing is something we look at, and then protection of the whistleblower, the retaliation against those who, and of course there are many things as well, the monitoring. So this is something very important, how we do the assessment. So now let me share with you the findings. Okay, let's start with the headlines. This is the overall quality or overall disclosure level across 5 ASEAN countries. And I know when you look at this, the first thing all of you see is where is Singapore, and I know many of you are based here. Of course, if you are based in other countries, you will see the countries. For most of you who are based here, since this is a Singapore Investor Association, let's look at Singapore. I think the immediate question is, or immediate impression you get is, Singapore is not ranked first. In fact, it's ranked third out of 5 countries. And in order of merit in terms of the level of disclosure, and I must emphasize again, disclosure, Malaysia, and I think there are many reasons for that, maybe I highlight some, has done very well. In fact, it's an, you know, this is a biennial study that we have done, and I'm very happy that SIAS has come in this year to provide the leadership for this study to make it even have a wider reach and, you know, better contribution. Malaysia for this study this year has moved up very much, leaps and bounds from very low base some 4 years ago. Thailand has also maintained, and I will also touch on why Thailand and Malaysia has gone up so much over the last few years, and Singapore half and half, steadily moving up, but the gradient is not as steep as the other countries, particularly Malaysia. We went through, and if you look at Malaysia, I think many of you are also aware that they have a very you know, strong head start in CSR, corporate social responsibility, at the turn in the early 2000s. Their stock exchange has already been promulgating, you know, the importance of corporate social responsibility. And this set of overall findings, it's not standalone. In fact, I should say that it's the relative ordering, and I think the ordering has some problems. We have discussed that in the panel maybe. It's very consistent with many other studies, especially, you know, in some related study, say the ASEAN Corporate Governance Scorecard, which my center has done with other parties. Singapore is also sometimes second or third after Thailand and Malaysia in ASEAN's corporate governance study. In the ASEAN Sustainability Reporting Study, the order is also about the same. Singapore is about second or third, depending on which year you look at. And I think that this is an issue we probably need to discuss in the panel, because as an upfront statement, I would say this, and I think that the panel should drill deep into this. There seems to be a gap between disclosure and practice. Sometimes I suspect certain companies or in certain countries may over disclose what they have under practice. In other words, they disclose more than they practice. In certain companies, they actually under disclose what they actually do. In other words, they are very reluctant, they are very reticent in disclosing particular say things on anti-corruption. And I would venture to say that perhaps, I'm not sure, I think the panelists can talk about it. Singapore companies are very reluctant, very shy, very, they're very calibrated to disclose too much about anti-corruption. Maybe because they are quite afraid that if one day something bombs, they will be caught very embarrassed. I'm not so sure. Maybe later we can have a good discussion in the next hour. Okay, in terms of the three categories, let's see where the other countries have done well. Thailand is very, very strong in internal commitment. Their board commitment, I think this is in line with the corporate governance result we got. Also, their disclosure discipline is very strong. Discipline of disclosure is very strong, and Malaysia is quite strong too. But Malaysia came out, especially in the last 2 years, in external commitment. And I think probably this is also inspired by things that are happening at the national level in Malaysia. And I would also say here that this study is done for companies. It has nothing to do with political leadership, national authorities, or totally government-linked company that are not listed on the stock exchange. So I would say this exclude entities like 1MDB, okay, or even their related company SRC. They are not in the sample. So this is something probably we can see how Malaysia has been doing it very well. Later we can see some of the reason, but Malaysia and also somewhat Thailand too are very strong in external. But having said that, the overall level for external compared to the previous internal, this is the previous Cat 1 internal compared to external, this is very, very low. I mean, this is somewhat very low. Okay, for the third category, reporting and monitoring, and you can see all the questions by the right-hand side. I think you can see just now, if I can recall the category 1 internal, the thing that I talk about, the 5 questions, 5 aspects. Category 2, the 5 aspects, which I already talked about in the overall rubric. The third one is the 3 aspects, which I talk about in the rubric. So these are not new. So this is something very interesting. In fact, some things that are very low would be even like code of conduct, quite low. Even training can be quite low too in many companies. So let's look at what our study also found during this pandemic. Some of the disclosure they have made, and I think definitely it's not good enough. From what we have gathered in the study, this is the state of disclosure on things related to pandemic, and I think it's only scratching at the surface. Many companies actually highlight some of the things they do, work from home schemes, their workplace measures that will be important in the pandemic. So quite a lot of disclosure on this work from home, how they actually continue to take care of the welfare of their workers working at home. I know, working at home is sometimes quite mind-boggling. In fact, I even see in the media, some companies, even some of the staff bring the whole telephone system home, set up a call center at home. I mean, it happens during work from home. A call center of whole company actually show up in the room of a HDB flat. Maybe they should charge the company rent, for working from home. But anyway, so and then many companies, and then it is good, highlighted donation to vulnerable groups during the pandemic, and many companies, particularly the manufacturer, took pain to disclose health and safety for the supply chain. So these are the 3 things, and I think it's definitely not enough. And I think the panel can probably drill deep into what else needs to be done, especially relating to business integrity. Because we also know that during this period, a lot of companies, because of the urgency, probably cut corners. Sometimes they may not go through the whole process of due diligence or even arm's length transaction. to get contracts, and I think for very good reason, things have to move fast. So this became sometimes public domain discussion as well. So the last thing before my ending at 3:30 sharp is their relationship with corporate governance and integrity. And I think even if I look at the STARS framework with our BI framework, there are many elements that are somewhat related. I mean, these are some pieces which I pick up from the rubric of both framework. I mean, upfront there is, but then what we have done is, as true scholars or researchers, I have asked my team of econometric expert in my center to run all the relationship tests using multiple regression. And what we have found, no need to worry about numbers, but what we have found is there's, in one sentence, there's a positive, significant positive relationship of business integrity impacting corporate governance as a dependent variable. So the business integrity is the independent variable. And this is at a very, very high level of statistical significance. You can see the bottom, you see the double asterisk is even more than 99%. Usually 95% confidence interval is what we want. Is used everywhere, including our sampling during the general election. They are 95% confident of the sampling percentages with the overall. And what we found is this is a good relationship, and market capitalization, size also matter. So even controlling for size, the business integrity impact, the relationship still stand. And I think this is actually the missing link. The foundation of good corporate governance is good business integrity. So beside all the insights, we have also statistically, in the spirit of true research, established the link. In fact, I expected the link, but the surprise I got is actually how come the link is so strong, you know? That was a surprise to me. The strength of the link, not so much the link, but the strength of the link is very strong. So let me just end by saying we have unraveled another foundation of corporate governance, but of course there are much more than that going forward. There are many, many aspects that needs to be done, but at least we have established another missing link in the overall picture of research in the evidence-based approach. So let me just conclude by saying business integrity and corporate governance is the moon and the stars. You know, corporate governance, we have the STAR framework, so we call it the stars, and of course stars are shining. Stars can also drop, so it's okay. So let me venture to say that business integrity is like the moon. There's the bright side of the moon. There's also the far side of the moon, which is the dark side that we can never see from planet Earth. And I think, in fact, only last year did one country manage to do a soft landing on the far side of the moon. That's China, using the Chang'e, which is the ferry for Mooncake Festival. So, you know, so I would say business integrity is almost like also Mooncake, which is one of the cultural festival among all the different ethnic groups. You know, the Mooncake Festival is one occasion where many issues in business integrity can take place. I myself have to confess, I also received many boxes of mooncake, but let me also say publicly in the audience here and also recorded, I donated all the mooncakes to my students, so it's for educational purposes. Every time a mooncake arrives, I bring it to my MBA class, EMBA class, and the students all love it. So this is the bright and dark side. Business integrity has two faces, the bright and the dark side. So let me end with just this quotation on one of my favorite books. Shoot for the moon, business integrity. Even if you miss, you will land among the stars, corporate governance. So I think I love this book, The Power of Positive Thinking, Norman Vincent Peale. So with that, thank you very much. And back to you, Mark. Back to you, Mark. Yep. Oh, is Mark there? Yep.
I do apologize. Professor Loh, thank you for your presentation. And Lo Wan-Chen is the moderator of our next panel discussion. Professor Lo, get ready to put up slide 10 again. You flashed very briefly what the regional comparisons were. I'm certain that any number of our participants here in the conference will be interested to know once again what the actual numbers were. So get ready to flash those. However, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next set of panelists. We're joined by the Group CFO of Capitaland, Andrew Lim, along with Ben Paul, Senior Correspondent at the Business Times, June Sim, Senior Vice President and Head of Listing Compliance at SGX Regco, Ms. Stephanie Yuen Teo, Joint Managing Director and Head of Corporate at TSMP Law Corporation, and the Chief Executive of the ASEAN CSR Network, Mr. Thomas Thomas. They're standing by to take your questions. We've had quite a few questions come in already. Please be sure to submit your questions at your earliest opportunity. To lead the conversation, here is Vice President of SIAS and the Chief Executive Asia Pacific of Black Sun, Lo Wan-Chen. Wan-Chen, over to you.
Afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much, Mark, for the introduction. Good afternoon, panelists. Let's quickly jump to it. I know we have an hour and a half, but time do pass very quickly. Maybe we'll start with a broad question for the panelists. Prof. Lo has presented very interesting findings. Maybe we can hear from the panelists your views on the findings. Surprise, expected, unexpected, shock. Maybe we can start with Andrew, then go on to June. Andrew, any your views on the findings?
Thanks, Nachan, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us to discuss this very important topic. I have to be honest, I wasn't surprised, particularly with the high correlation between integrity and governance. In fact, you probably have to have some thought behind how to separate the two. And when you think about integrity and you think about governance, they tend to fit hand in glove. I think the way Prof. Lo characterized it was very eloquent. You need that framework of governance in order to have an ability to impart a culture of governance and doing the right thing. And to borrow a phrase from Prof. Lo about integrity being doing what is right even when no one is looking, I suppose that's that extra step that culture then allows you to instill in your employees. So to answer your question, Unachen, I'm not surprised with the high correlation between integrity and corporate governance.
Thanks, Andrew. And we hear from June, and after that we go to Ben. So June, from yourself, shock, surprise, business as usual?
Well, I must say that I was surprised by the scores for disclosures. But I think that is one area where it is very difficult to regulate, meaning the disclosures would have to be very much left to board of directors. But in terms of business integrity, it's not a new area that regulators are concerned with. If you look at what we've done during the global financial crisis, we have also engaged boards of directors to look into high-risk areas. So this is one conversation that would have to continue and would have to be heightened, especially during this year, and we expect to engage listed companies closely, especially those where we have concerns from our observations in terms of their disclosures.
Okay, thanks, June. Let's hear from Ben, and then we go on to Thomas. Ben, your views on the study by Prof. Lo?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I thought it was a very interesting presentation that he had, and I was just sort of sitting here reflecting on the meaning of it all. I guess in a way, integrity or culture is what we fall back on in our interaction with other people when the rules of engagement are not clear, or perhaps when the rules of engagement are too complicated. So, and I think it has to start from the top. It's important that the people at the very top of the organization set the appropriate standards and examples that can be adopted by by the rest of the organization. And I think when you have the right culture, it's helpful in navigating situations where the rules are not clear. And I think it's also helpful in writing rules that can be adopted in a practical way.
All right, thanks, Paul. We've heard culture mentioned quite a few times from Andrew, from June, from Ben, and culture is going to be some of our pondering questions I'm going to have for the panelists in a while. But before that, let's go on to Thomas and then with Stephanie after that. Thomas, what's your view on the findings? Were you shocked that Malaysia ranked #1 in terms of disclosure and Singapore is far behind third?
No, actually, I'm not shocked because if you look at in the past, Thailand doing very well compared to the rest of ASEAN countries and now Malaysia. I think there are, I would off the top of my head say there are two factors. One, Malaysian companies became more interested in this because they just passed the Corporate Liability Act. So companies in the past, they can say some of their minions who did this thing wrong and they take the punishment. Now the organization has to be responsible for the actions of their employees. And that strongly sets the tone from the top that boards are more interested because they are going to be held with greater liability. I think that's the first point. The second point is when you want to be clean in a dirty world, you put in more effort to show that you are more clean. And when governments and establishments think, so I think there is also a tendency of Singapore companies to leave it to the government to decide anything. We take directions and I think we have to go beyond just enforcement into really getting this embedded. And I just want to make one other point that is important. I think you find it in Prof. Lo's slides. The external commitments have been low. And tied to my first point, the external drivers in Singapore is normally whether you get caught and you get prosecuted. But in the other side, it's also a question of public image, how different you are, and therefore the external factors in changing things like corporate liability laws, the interest of investors, institutional investors, going and having more due diligence. So I think the whole question of due diligence exercises are also comes up very clearly in the background.
Right, thanks, Thomas. We'll go on to Stephanie. Stephanie, your views on were you shocked, surprised? And after this, after Stephanie, we'll go on to Prof. So we'll give Prof some time to ponder a couple of hot potato questions on capital, on disclosure. So while we let the Prof prepare, Stephanie, back to you. What's your views on the findings?
Thank you, and hi, everyone. I've been a lawyer too long, and I have to admit to a certain cynicism when it comes to the ability to measure business integrity. You can certainly measure disclosure, but whether disclosure is going to be a good gauge in and of itself of the degree of integrity and therefore lack of corruption, I have to confess I have some problems with that. I know you need some form of measurement, and it's important that we have these research papers, but some of the points that Prof. Lo's paper highlighted, scale of the company is very important, but at the same time, one of the most high profile corruption cases was Keppel, and I don't think you can find very many companies in Singapore with much larger scale than Keppel. Of course, that was done through some representatives. They were errant representatives. The company takes responsibility. I'm not saying the company was, at its board level, I'm sure they tried very, very hard not to infringe any such laws. But my difficulty with this whole premise is that it's very hard to measure something like this. And without running down our neighbors, to compare corruption between Malaysia and Singapore, I think, just off the top of my head, I'd have a clear winner, and that would be Singapore. So their disclosure levels may be very high. If you're going to correlate disclosure with corruption, then, I'm afraid I have some difficulty with that as well. So Prof, back to you. Am I completely off my head?
Prof. Lo, again to
Stop laughing at me, Ben.
I can't help it.
Prof, how can we talk about Malaysia as well? I mean, they may have better disclosure than we have, and you're ticking certain boxes certainly. But you know, when it comes to corruption and business integrity, I mean, come on.
Yep. And with moderator permission, let me jump in now. I think
yes, please go ahead, Prof. Loh.
Yes, and of course, all my fellow panelists. I think it's definitely a very, very, I would say, important question. I would say that a disclosure is not a sufficient condition that something is being done. But at the same time, it might be a necessary condition, but definitely not sufficient. But so having said that, the whole study is on disclosure, just like many other corporate governance and sustainability study. At least having the disclosure is a first step of commitment, whether you reach it or not, whether it's an aspirational target. That is, of course, something we have to say. But what I'm more worried about is not so much the measurement, not so much the conceptualization, but actually, if disclosure are so important, especially for investors, why is it that the Singapore companies don't seem to disclose so much? Because if you look at the CPI study, Corruption Perception Index at the country level, which I already showed, you know, the perception of Singapore as a country, which actually includes also, in fact, I say principally the companies, is perceived so favorably in the whole world. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts of all the specific aspects of disclosure as laid out by Transparency International, which is, you know, a very respectable agency, they do a lot of study. And in fact, even the irony is that both studies were actually originated by Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index, and my study, which is based on the TI study, come from the same source, cut from the same cloth, but it shows very fundamentally distinctive results. So I'm not so sure where is the gap. First of all, is the gap important? Do we need to close it? Secondly, if it doesn't matter, we can just go more of the same and, you know, continue not to disclose, which is fine too. I mean, as long as we know the companies are doing well. In fact, Stephanie, I think you are saying something very interesting, which is you might be alluding to. The more a company disclose, actually, maybe it might seem that something is cooking inside there. Therefore, perhaps they feel guilty conscious and they disclose. I'm not sure.
Is that possibly going to be your next study, Prof? There's a next step to look at that gap, the gap between disclosure and practice. I mean, there's a perception that Malaysia discloses a lot, but practice very little. And could possibly in Singapore, we disclose very little, but we practice a lot. But also could there be potentially be hidden problems like the capital issue, where they disclose a lot and yet there's a time bomb that's sitting there. Are there more time bombs in the Singapore context? So maybe Prof, you can answer that and the rest of the panels can chime
very
in.
Quick. Okay, let me quickly say that so that I can leave my colleagues to say more. That definitely, I think that the gap is very important. And I think to do that, we need more qualitative field studies of companies, because I need to get into the company, to get into the boardroom. And I think usually most companies will be quite unwilling to share some of their internal issues with us. So I think that the gap is probably to look at what they actually do. But of course, early on, many of the panelists talk about this magic word called culture. And I think that, you know, of course,
we will talk about culture,
we can, and culture, you know, whether you can measure them, I think culture may be a half step to look at beyond just going into the companies, because in culture, there are many ways to actually assess a company. Now I think the fashionable thing, at least from the UK, is culture reporting. At least we have another step that's halfway closer, even though it is totally not, I would say, even enough to connote that. So that may be a half step. A full step may not be possible. But other than that, I think that the gap is something perhaps I think June is listening intently. When in doubt, the regulator comes in.
Okay, let's kick the ball to the regulator, because there's a question on for
you know,
June as to whether the regulator is going to do more in terms of disclosure. So June, How do we close the gap? I mean, we disclose so little, but yet could there be time bombs running around?
Yeah.
From our perspective, in terms of review of announcements or reports that are put up by companies, there is only so much the regulators can do in terms of posing queries, right? But if it relates to those areas on business integrity, right, on corruption, it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to check the box in terms of asking questions, because it very much depends on what companies have in place in terms of their reporting framework, the checks and balances that they have on practices relating to bribery and corruption. So we can do as much as we can in terms of querying, but at the end of the day, I think it would be incumbent on boards to make sure that they have measures and safeguards in place, right? And then where actions are taken, either in terms of putting in place procedures, they would follow through such procedures to make sure that the outcome is not one which is very surprising or shocking to investors, right? So, so to answer that question, what can we do where we come across disclosures that are lacking? We can query, but that it would be difficult in areas pertaining to business integrity.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to tick the box. So Thomas,
I would just want to put in context the Malaysian example, that I think you're unfair to say the Malaysians are backward. There may be a perception, but I think many years ago, Malaysia had a minister called Senator Paul Lau, who was a former president of Transparency International of Malaysia.
And he was a minister in the
Prime Minister's office, and he was doing governance, integrity, and human rights. He was covering that. And even before 1NDB blew up, he was trying to get companies to have an integrity framework, getting them to sign integrity pledges, getting them at ASEAN level, he was trying to promote the culture of integrity and anti-corruption and to mainstream these things up. So I think you will see that in Malaysian companies they do. And in fact, the sensitive, so-called sensitive, some of the sensitive companies, he actually seconded people from the anti-corruption agency to some of these companies. So I think these are, I think the governments and some officials are corrupt, but some of the businesses, they tried very hard to do this. So even on human rights study that ASEAN-CSR did, we find that some of the Malaysian companies like Sime Darby are way ahead of the rest of it. And the other point is that they also know when the politicians and others are being difficult or have to be sensitive. It's all the more the boards, very high integrity. Some of them have very high integrity and they try to protect themselves. So I think it is not fair to assume certain things, but I want to say that even if we put in the effort to do this, and the disclosure is when we try to do these reporting studies, we state that you have to do, and unless you do, you don't report. And what could happen is that there are a lot of companies who consider some of these actions as implicit, and they are not explicit enough. So I think these studies helps companies to be more explicit and therefore help to mainstream some of the better habits.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Let's kick the ball to Ben, and then we'll go to Andrew. So Ben, you recently wrote an article in the Business Times on the role of independent directors to help the investors. So would there be a role for independent investors to help to close that gap between what is being reported and what is being practiced?
Oh yes, I mean definitely there's a role for them, but I think it comes back to the same thing. It's a question of having the appropriate rules, of course, but also you've got to have the right culture and the right integrity. I mean, you've got to have some personal integrity in order to foster the culture in your organization. So definitely they have a role to play. But I wonder if I could just pick up on a couple of points raised by Thomas as well as Stephanie. I did actually have the opportunity to look at the study, and one of the things that jumped out at me, as Thomas brought up, was that there seems to be some ambivalence on external commitment to anti-corruption disclosures as it relates to agents and suppliers and so on. And one of the things I've observed over the years is that corporate scandals in Singapore often originate from outside of the country. So that was true of 1MDB and Keppel and so on. And I think this is an important issue for Singapore because, you know, we're so plugged into the rest of the world, including places where, you know, where the culture is probably quite different. So how do boards in Singapore navigate this world and at the same time hold on to their personal integrity and not corrupt their own corporate culture and not run afoul of corporate governance standards here? So it's interesting for me to see that other countries are sort of, you know, grappling with this issue as well in the same area, and perhaps there's something that we can learn from each other. Now, just on the matter of the difference between Malaysia and Singapore, I think in fairness to, I completely agree with Stephanie, by the way. I think that there is no comparison when it comes to when it comes to the issue of corruption in the two countries. But I think in fairness to the Malaysian public listed companies, I think they really do try. And I think this is why they disclose so much, is because they are fully aware that they operate in an environment where the culture is not great as far as corruption is concerned.
So Ben, I think the issue is one of trust, isn't it? It's one whether we trust the government to police the environment in a way where the right principles are espoused and held up. So in Malaysia, there's probably a bit of a lack of trust, if I can make the ultimate understatement of the day, with the government and with the country. I mean, 1MDB really happened in the backyard. It was a political scandal before it was a corporate scandal. So I think there's a question of culture of trust there. It's also a question of whether you trust the companies that you're working with, and the people that you're working with. And you brought up what is basically the elephant in the room. If you work in a country where corruption is the modus operandi, you've got to find a way to either, you either can't operate there, or you can't operate in that sector where there is corruption, or you've got to find a way to third party it. And in a lot of these countries, what you do is the corporate will pay a consultant to facilitate certain transactions happening. They'll pay a broker to get the thing done. And that brokerage fee is effectively a way for the broker to be a conduit to make sure that some payment is made. I mean, I'm probably speaking out of school, but this is how it's done, isn't it? And that's why there are third-party service providers to do these things. And that's
absolutely, it's a great job creator in Malaysia.
Yeah, exactly.
and I think people on both sides of the causeway are quite surprised. I mean, I think Malaysians are surprised how easily Singaporeans trust each other. I think Singaporeans are often surprised at how little trust there is among even Malaysians when they do business.
Yeah, exactly. So I think looking at a study in and of itself, when a study has too many boxes to tick, I think, and too many metrics to look at, which are just objective, rational metrics, without looking at the environment that you're operating in and taking and putting that into account, I think it becomes much harder to understand how much and how far you can take those metrics. And so that's my difficulty. There are ways of looking at what's happening in the Philippines, in Thailand. If you look at it holistically, I'm pretty sure, look, I wear red and white every damn day, right? So I really believe in what Singapore is doing. We're trying our best to improve, but our rankings are really high. So if we say that our trajectory, to use Professor Lawrence Lowe's words, is rather more marginal than in other countries, it's because we're doing pretty damn well, Prof. Lowe, I think. So, so yes, it's incremental, but I think we're doing pretty well already. And especially if you look at the world that we operate in, the corruption cases that come about tend to be so-and-so went and took some personal money, he got bribed. I mean, there was a recent LTA official who's being charged for bribery. It's things like that, as opposed to a sort of wide-scale, endemic, structural corruption that's happening in the companies.
Andrew, can we hear from you on the gap between disclosure and in practice? Then after that, we come back to Lawrence. There's a question on whether
I forgot
integrity.
The question on
No problem, Andrew. Seems to be a gap between disclosure and being in practice.
Yeah. It goes back to culture. It absolutely goes back to culture, and it's multifaceted. So the point was made about operating in different countries. And I think it was Steph who said that if you have a overly rigid framework that you misapply into different jurisdictions, then you will run into trouble because you can't operate and your business dies. So it all goes back to instilling that gap that I think you speak of, which is that difference between what it means to have integrity and what it means to follow the rules. Because the rules will not always apply, and the rules have to be, are formulated for one jurisdiction. They may not be relevant or absolutely relevant for another jurisdiction. And that is where, when you're representing your company, you're the only one at the meeting, and you've got the opportunity to make some money for your company, you have to make a decision that will rest on the integrity that you have. And that is, at that point, going to rest on the culture of the company that you work for. So we bandy this term about, I cannot overemphasize it enough. It is very, very difficult to instill and to maintain. It is a living, breathing thing, but at the same time, it is absolutely essential for companies to build upon if you have any hope of maintaining integrity.
Okay, let's hold that word culture. We come back to you, June. We go to Prof. Loh first.
Okay.
But June, there's a disclosure requirement on culture in the Code of Corporate Governance for Singapore, for Malaysia, for UK. How is the SGX going to enforce this? So let me think about it. Let's go back to Prof. Loh.
Okay.
There's a question on whether business integrity is the right word to use in your study, because we seem to talk about culture, and culture is shared values. And integrity is only but one value. We talk about truth. We talk about honesty. Should your study include more of these values?
I think if you look at what we are doing, just to be specific to the question, we have adapted the Transparency International framework because there's a lot of I would say benchmarking. I didn't have the chance to talk about the benchmarking and the results and the comparison, but because of that, we have to follow the nomenclature. In fact, the actual wording of Transparency International is on anti-corruption programs. The whole bucket of things in the TI study was called, to be very precise, let me recall, reporting on anti-corruption programs. So what we did in Singapore is to flip it to the positive side of the same thing. And I fully appreciate the chat question that perhaps is a bit ring fence and quite narrow, because when you surface that out, even though all our measures and all our aspects relate to anti-corruption, the undertone, in fact, I would say even the overtone, the overtures are all relating to broader issue of trust, of culture, and sometimes when we talk about the gap there, it becomes a very noisy construct for us to debate. And in fact, I think my last point is this. Actually, we don't even need to talk about business integrity, corruption, or governance, or sustainability, anything. It's just one fundamental question. Do you think disclosure is important for investor? Whatever it is, disclosure about what they do in a company, be it governance related, sustainability, or anything else, because disclosure is a method of assurance. In the same way that accountants brief by disclosure of financial figures, if we think that disclosure is important, the rest is, there's less need to really hone down the nitty-gritty, because the other opposite of disclosure is trust. I think this is Stephanie very strong argument, and also so I want to ring fence the argument like a debater, ring fence it, and then really rigorously discuss it. Is disclosure important in the investor-driven world? Whatever the context, the content, then let's look about it. And if we feel disclosure is important to assure investors, then we can fit in integrity or anything. I think that the arguments will be more or less the same.
Anchan, can I answer that? I mean,
yes,
if the question that we're answering today, Prof. Loh, is disclosure important? I think everybody will say yes, and we can go home. Okay. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? I mean, obviously disclosure is important.
Yeah.
The question is, what do you disclose when it's something as woolly as integrity and corruption, right? what do you disclose? And secondly, how do you make sure that what you're disclosing is being implemented in an effective way to achieve its objectives? And that's, I think, much, much harder to achieve. And it must be considered in the context of the country in which you're operating and the businesses where you're operating. So, you know, I agree that disclosure is important. I think everybody here would do. We can all go home now.
Okay. Your Honor, Un Chen, may I make my submission? I think this almost
you said debates for a lawyer, so what was I supposed to do with that, bro?
No, I think you're right. It may be woolly, but precisely because it's woolly, Stephanie, therefore we need certain standard for disclosure. Precisely because it's woolly, we need the cotton to make it more explicit, to show it up. The cotton, I mean, let's not talk about cotton and wool. I think there's some debate what it means and what's the difference.
Yes.
No sheep, please.
No sheep.
June, let's come back to you, June, on disclosure, the corporate governance requirements for culture. So culture comprises of integrity, honesty, trust, all the good things about doing things properly or doing things when people are not looking. In the Singapore Code, it talks about having appropriate culture at all levels. How do you enforce that disclosure?
I think one of the ways of encouraging disclosure, right? In other words, when what should we do to make sure that when no one is watching, right? Companies and boards and management behave. So in order to raise standards of business integrity and to foster, right, the culture of detecting, right, and being able to deal with misconduct and wrongdoing, that's something that SGX-RECO has given thought to it. And I say this because in our consultation paper, we consulted, and that consultation ended in September. And in that consultation paper, we have put in place, we have proposed that companies put in place and disclose arrangements that they have to receive and investigate whistleblowing allegations. So it is important to provide the avenue for such matters to be detected, and that would encourage a culture of compliance. So in SGX itself, SGX-RECO, we preach what we consult. We set up a whistleblowing office, right, in January, and that's a dedicated whistleblowing office. So in order to inculcate culture of compliance and doing the right things, you must always have an avenue for detection, right, and protection of the whistleblower. So that's what we have done in practice to make sure that and to at least assist in raising the standards of business integrity and promoting culture of compliance.
Quick question on Malaysia. Malaysia has a Section 17A on the MACC Anti-Corruption Act, where it enforces penalties for corruption. Do you think SGX would go along that route where we have something as specific as Section 17A, and maybe the rest also can chime in? Maybe Thomas can chime in on that after June.
Well, I'm not sure this familiar about the act, but if I could just tell you, when we were doing when the ASEAN CSR network, as part of things, we had a working group on integrity in ASEAN. And we just did some years ago a study on why people, what are the common challenges that people face. And the first one that came out is what I would call first mover disadvantage. Company says, look, I don't want the one to be the first to say I am against corruption because it might affect my business. So the first mover does not have the advantage, it's a disadvantage. Because if the competitors can pay their way and I can't, I'll be a disadvantage. So it thinks. The second one is our culture, giving gifts, showing appreciation, giving a great packet is culture. And I think this is, but the question I ask is, when does the gift, it's all right to give a gift, but when does the gift becomes a bribe? This comes there. Yeah. And the third one is there's no incentives, to be honest. But if I reflect back on it, I think at the end of the day, a lot of people, companies are giving way to bribery and corruption because it's convenience. If your goods are stuck in the go down in a certain country for days and it becomes things, Is it going through the whole process, which takes it months, or if it's perishable, you have great loss, or then the company says it's more convenient to just pay somebody to get through the whole process. So I think what boards has to do, and it turns with governance, the key point is, do your company's processes makes it difficult for people to do work? In my trade union days, my old days, I have come across this definition of management. They say management is a process of making it difficult for people to work. And top management should change that thing to make it easy for processes. When you have easy, then it is not inconvenient to go against bribery. And bribery and corruption does not become a convenience. I think that's the way forward. And the other point about that we are clean and all this and export, you're very correct that corruption is exporting. TI actually came out a report today on Exporting Corruption Report 2020 about countries, 47 countries, on that it is quite widespread. And I think it's worth looking at it and say, don't assume that we don't export and we are that clean. I think we are, a lot of companies, I mean, I'm told by some executives, hey, you know, I bring jobs into Singapore. If I don't have these contracts, you guys don't have jobs. Okay, so I think there is, that's why I think it's important we look at what is the causes and things. And disclosure for me is important because we target the areas that can be put in place to make things inconvenient to have corruption. Make it convenient, be clean.
So it's still about culture. Maybe we can ask Stephanie, how do you measure, how do you disclose culture in the organization? Then we can go to Ben, followed by Andrew. How do you measure, how do you disclose culture? Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that. I think it's important to have systems in place internally, but you need to make sure that those systems are working. And one of the things that we talked about just now, which is that the larger format companies have better disclosure, etc. That's because they've got deeper pockets to pay for disclosure and compliance people to do it for them. The SMEs may not be any more corrupt. They may have as much business integrity, but they're busy making a living, and they're small enough so they can't afford it. So, you know, again, this works at a very large corporation level, at a large market cap level. I, as an investor, would rather make sure that the companies are actually focusing on doing their work and doing it well, than that they are, you know, filling in so many forms and all these reports. So that's the first thing. Secondly, how do we measure culture? I'm really not sure that we can. I think we can measure a company's. I think we can measure. We can look at what the company's systems are. For looking at, to Professor Mark's point in the Q&A, he asked whether we should have a whistleblowing policy across all companies. I mean, most of us are encouraged to have whistleblowing centers, but you know, for the 9 years that I sat on a listed company, I didn't get one single whistleblowing report. Now that's either because we do a damn bang up job of running the company, or you know, people don't trust the whistleblowing. Don't trust the whistleblowing system, or they don't really have very much to report. It could just be that we're very, very good. And to a point that somebody made to me recently, if you really want to be, if you really want to have business integrity and have good disclosure, then you should also disclose when you screw up. Okay.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So is that something that should be done? Can I just say that if you've actually fixed it, I don't necessarily want to know, because then you're going to tank my share price if I'm an investor in your company, and you've already fixed the problem. So it's really about whether you've got good management. I need to trust the management team rather than trust the systems, is what. So
we've been hearing trust. So trust, integrity are twins. So maybe, so Ben, from your point of view, should we get companies to disclose what have gone wrong and how they fixed it? Just like, should we disclose internal audit findings, internal audit reports? Nobody knows what the internal auditors have found or fixed.
Well, as a journalist, I really wish they would disclose things that have gone wrong. Mostly they try to cover them up long after the fact. So, but I agree with Stephanie. I don't know how you can measure something like culture. I mean, it's something that's apparent when you meet the people at the company. I think I think that's clear. When you meet the key decision maker at the company, you get a pretty good idea of what his personal values are and how that sort of disseminated across the company, depending on the size of the company. But it's quite hard to measure across the whole market, I think. But I do think that these things, as I said before, really do start at the top. And I think maybe there is, and maybe other people can chime in on this, whether it's time for Singapore to create laws to govern the way companies in Singapore behave overseas, or when they engage with customers and agents overseas. Maybe it's time that you have, yes, exactly, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, which, by the way, was the reason it was actually how Keppel ended up paying that fine. If you remember, they were not prosecuted under Singapore laws. Apparently, Singapore didn't have the right laws to go after them, but the US did.
Yeah, talking about Keppel, Ben, do you want to answer the question? How would a large company like Keppel, with lots of disclosure, something has gone wrong, and things can still go wrong? So once again, the gap between disclosure and practice. How can Keppel avoid the next big thing, the next big wrongness?
I mean, how does anything go wrong in a company? I mean, they know, people know what the rules are, but the company is also trying to make money, frankly. It's operating in an environment where this is the way things get done. And can I say, it was not just Keppel. Keppel was the one that paid the fine, but Sembcorp Marine, as you know, was involved with a similar set of agents and was also involved in the same car wash operation. It's just that they were not caught in the same way that Keppel was.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Andrew, over to you. How do you measure culture? And after this, we go back to Prof. Loh. There are a couple of questions on how you measure integrity and transparency. A couple of questions from the Philippines, if you look at the Q&A. Let you digest those two questions, Prof. Loh. But let's go back to Andrew. How do you measure culture and comply with the Code of Corporate Governance? Any report is coming up, you have to do the CG code. How do you disclose culture?
I think the panel has expressed the difficulty of what it means to measure culture, and we have the same difficulties at CapitaLand. I would perhaps try to answer it in the following way. One of our independent directors shared a story with us. She serves on the board of an MNC, and that MNC operates in multiple jurisdictions in emerging markets and so on and so forth. And the only way that they could ensure that this culture of integrity, or how they chose to measure that culture of integrity, was to continue to instill a certain set of behaviors such that at the point of time where one of their representatives, in a far-flung corner of the world, would enter into a meeting to negotiate, you have arrived when your counterpart doesn't even bother trying. Because then you have succeeded. You have succeeded in transmitting this culture that exists within your company beyond the four walls of the company itself, such that your counterparties, your vendors, your customers are aware that there's no point. The culture is too strong. The integrity is impermeable. And I think that's how I would measure it. If my guys come back from other countries and they say, Andrew, we're not seeing it. It's pretty quiet. We're losing our fair share of deals, but I'm also not getting strange requests. I'm not getting agents calling me up other than the bona fide ones. And I think that is probably a good way to arrive at a conclusion internally that I think we are winning that battle. How you measure it quantitatively, I have no idea. Or how you express that publicly, I do not know. But I do know when I sit in front of my team and I report to my independent directors, and I tell them this is what we are getting on the ground. I think you then start to feel that we are winning that battle, and it's a battle you constantly fight because the line is always moving.
Yeah, so possibly you can take that. I'll come back to you, Thomas. So possibly it's part of stakeholder engagement, where you get a feel, you put your tentacles as to how you rate in terms of corporate culture. Thomas?
Yeah, can I just also say, Unachan, before Thomas jumps in, that the sharing of the wins and the losses is incredibly important. You can't just pat yourself on the back for the 9 times that you did well. The one time that you messed up and you got tripped up may be more valuable than the 9 times that you did well. And I think that's something, I'm not sure you legislate it, but you have to build that into the culture where you celebrate your wins, but you have to absolutely share your losses, because that's when you learn.
Food for thought, June, regulate it, share your losses.
No, not necessarily regulated.
Thomas?
Could I just say one point very quick? You cannot measure culture. Culture is never been measured. But I think in all these social responsibility frameworks, they talk about values and principles. You must have these values and principles embedded in all your decisions. Value principles are accountability, transparency, ethical behavior. You have to reinforce that you have to respect shareholders, stakeholder values, rule of law, international norms, human rights, etc. So you can make a decision on a commercial thing, and then you fall back and say, does this go with my values of respecting people, treating people with dignity, respect, and fairness? Is it ethical? Is it so? That's the way. And the other point is I just want to talk about Andrew's point. I also used to work for MNC. I think the point is a lot of people are not offered bribes, not because it's the culture of the company, but you just have to tell the other party that I'm sorry, you can offer me a bribe if I will lose my job. And because I will lose my job, people say it's no go. You know, nobody will do anything to lose his job. So I think it again comes back to the systems in place in your company that can give the employees the courage to say, I'm sorry, I can't do it. There is absolutely no way the company is prepared to lose the business rather than to lose their conscience or do the wrong thing. And I think that's where it's more than culture. It's culture is when these values get embedded, it's part of you. And people look at you and they don't offer you because the organization you represent are standing up for zero tolerance of those things. So I think that's important. And coming for bad and good lessons, I think learning from failures is important for organizations. So it's the question, then you have to have a culture that I don't punish you for every mistake you make. But so I can share my mistakes without fear of reprisals. I can say, yes, I made some stupid decisions and the consequences has been this. And I want to say in ASEAN CSR network, we're not trying to create this network of companies. We just did some sharing where companies comes in, strict rules, tell me what is your mistakes that you have made, what is your biggest mistake there, what did you learn from it and how to operate. That is really useful. And it has to be closed doors. I'm sorry, Paul, man, you can't have those stories because nobody wants to expose their weaknesses. They all like to put up their positive and the positive. But in the closed room, I think these are worth sharing. And I think within organizations, you should also encourage people to come up and say, yes, these are this is how people are tempted. Sometimes you don't even know that these are being done. So it's good to learn from people, learn from bad experiences.
And that could be part of sustainability reporting.
Okay.
Yes, Stephanie?
We talk about big corporate failures and big corruption. I think when somebody comes and offers you a multi-million-dollar bribe, you know that you're in the wrong space, right?
Yep.
But in Singapore, the operating culture is probably less about big corruption matters as it is about small cronyism, little biases that help. And I think that small corruption is actually more insidious in changing our society for the worse than the big cases, because you know that you shouldn't steal money, you know that you shouldn't take $1 million bribe, all right? But the smaller things, give it to your friend, All right.
A wink
He's
and a
gone to a
nod.
nice dinner before. He will
Yeah.
scratch your back when it's the right time. He's just given your daughter an internship at his accounting firm. You know that all these little cronyism things are very important. All
Yeah,
right.
he erodes trust.
I mean, especially in a small, corporate village like ours, those relationships that sort of build the old boys network, that is a grave concern. The second point is this: while I agree that we cannot measure culture, I do think that, like, was it Giuliani who instituted the Broken Windows program in New York? He says you can't put out the really, really big crimes necessarily, but you can stop by having all the small crimes picked up on. And so if you're a CEO in a company, all the way down to your senior management team and all the way to the middle management team by then, have a zero tolerance. When somebody comes to you and says, boss, somebody asked me for a $500,000 payment to facilitate this deal, shall I give it to them? You don't just say no, you say, I can't even believe you're considering this. And you set out exactly what you believe the values are. So never miss an opportunity to express the values that your corporation espouses. I think that that's actually more important than to be able to evaluate it or to put a number on it. So I actually think that in Singapore, so the issues that Malaysia and Philippines maybe face on corruption are different from the ones that we face. And we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we scored very high, 85, very good. It should really be, all right, if we don't have that kind of massive corruption, because our society doesn't lend itself to that, not because people aren't necessarily greedy, what kind of corruption do we have and how should we try to root that out? And I think that that's just as important.
I totally agree with you, Stephanie. Totally agree with you.
And Stephanie, that's the point that some of our neighboring countries tell about us, that we don't have grand corruption, but we have great corruption. That's
she put out on the wall. Prof. Loh, a couple of questions on the Philippines, how they measure integrity.
Okay.
You want to address those questions?
Yes. I think the two chat questions are quite specific in nature. And as a true teacher, maybe I like to give some homework. You see, after today, I think SIAS as organizer will pull out my transparency to be publicly available for participants on the website. And also there's a full report that accompanies this presentation today. The full report is 48 pages, excluding the cover. And in the report, there was a lot of discussion on the assessment rubric, the 13 aspects, and more importantly, the annex. I think that our friend from Philippines asked about how to measure that. That one, even in the Philippine context, or even in all contexts, we have a very detailed description on each aspect, including the scaling. How we scale the 0.5, what are the specific things a company must do or disclose, actually to disclose to get the point. So I think from a practical viewpoint, that there's this report that will be made available, and I hope my Philippines comrades can take cue from there. And if you still have any doubts, I think you can actually contact me. That's after sales service. So to see whether there's anything, because I think many of the issues are very, very specific, and definitely I think if I go into the details, it will offend all my panelists. I know we are talking about very, very controversial issues now, even like how to measure culture. And I also have my take on this, I mean, if I may.
Yeah, please go ahead, Prof. What's your take on measuring culture?
I think that, despite all the conceptualization and, all the rationalization of culture, ultimately, I think let's look at it from a very practical viewpoint. When you talk about how to measure, who are the people that you usually go to? So usually you go to the valuers, you go to the accountants. Right, I mean that's how corporate management, the experts are doing it. So for valuation and for accounting, I think usually culture is as part of what we call intangible assets. As you know, there's nothing, no item on the balance sheet on my side. It's a culture. There's a dollar value, and then you put that as an asset. But usually it's part under goodwill. And I think there are some expert accountants probably in the audience that might enlighten us as well. Usually, the measurement is not zero based. In other words, there's no first principle building up of culture. Usually a value is only attributed when it's realized. In other words, when something is sold. So I think So there's actually the other gap is between corporate management measurement by the valuers and accountants versus what we are talking. And we can talk, but we can't attach a value. And the value is something when we can attach some economic connotation to it, which is a dollar amount. Only the accountants and the valuers can do it. And right now, there's already a lot of challenge there at that counting level, let alone our debating level. I think we can talk until the sunset, but I think the key issue is we know that it's important, but what is more important is not so much how it's measured, but is that it's being seriously committed to by companies, even if it's something very qualitative in nature. Okay,
thanks, Prof. There's a question on how do you check the integrity on board members? In the Singapore Code of Corporate Governance, it says that companies must have appropriate culture at all levels. But is there such thing as one culture of the organization, or does culture exist in different forms at the board level, at the management level, at the working level? If you look at the Wells Fargo fraud case, it says that one of the cause of the fraud, the account opening fraud, was culture in the middle that caused a fraud. So maybe I can hear from the panelists.
Maybe can hear from Ben. He's been very active in the REIT space on some of the current mergers and acquisition, as well as some of the board issues.
Yeah, well,
HT, ESR.
Yeah, ESG is a hot news. So Ben, is there one culture of organization, or does a board's culture drive everything?
I very much believe it starts from the top, and I think it starts from the personal integrity of the people who are sitting there. But you raise an interesting point. How do you measure it? Short of meeting these people, it becomes clear once you meet them what their thinking is and how they're likely to behave. But how do you measure it and compare it? I think that's a difficult thing. Right now, one of the things I was writing about recently was all the rules that are out there to determine a director is independent or not. And it's so compliance driven in Singapore. There's so many factors to consider, and yet some of those factors are not, it's not compulsory, it's not mandatory. So there's still a lot of leeway to decide whether someone is independent or not. But as far as investors are concerned, it becomes very clear whether a director is independent or not, depending on whether he or she recommends a deal that you are either in favor of or not in favor of. So it's very difficult to judge, I think, except in very very specific cases.
Anybody want to chime in, Thomas? Does everything starts from the tone at the top?
I completely agree, because I have seen and dealt with people at the middle or near the top becoming completely different when the guy on the top of him changes. Many organizations, and so even when you talk about corporate culture, you'll be very surprised how fast the organization's culture can change, because people are motivated by incentives. If I have to do some things in order to go ahead in life, so it's also a question of how much you embed in it. So that's where one of my concerns is there's a lot of external drivers, but what about internalizing some of these values? I have come across senior executives who quietly would leave the organization rather than sell their values and principles. So I'm just saying, I completely agree with Ben that the tone from the top is the most important. And Singapore would not have succeeded if we did not have also, to a large part of our values of the country that we talk about, is also on the tone from the top.
Yeah.
Stephanie?
Marshall, I completely agree. You have to start it from the top, but it's not just, is the boss prepared to take a bribe? All right, does he cut corners? It's also, what is the culture amongst the C-suite? Do they have values that I think are correct? I mean, if he's running around behind his wife, and he's got a girlfriend in the office and he's encouraging other people to have girlfriends in the office, then so integrity and honesty isn't important to him on a personal level. What makes you think it's going to be important to him on a corporate level? So
who is responsible for culture in organization? The chairman of the board?
It's a full board.
I think everybody needs to be responsible for that, right? So the chairman certainly should set the tone. The CEO is very important because he's going to set the tone for the management team. And frankly, most of the management team don't have very much to do with the board of directors. And the board of directors aren't necessarily encouraged to get their hands, so much involved in the day-to-day running, because that steps on various toes. But I think all those people are important. And, I've been known to be a little bit outspoken from time to time. And when I see things that I think are not right or that will actually have a downstream effect on the culture, I will call them out. I've called out people who I feel have been, not respectful to women. For example, when somebody used a bad example, I've called him out. And when other people, and there was somebody else at the meeting who stood up at the end and he said, look, I want to apologize for laughing when this gentleman made this sexist remark. So I think it's important with the smallest prejudices, sometimes little things that you don't think about or you don't want to make a big fuss about because they'll make you look sensitive. I think it's important to call out, and I think it's everybody's responsibility to set the right culture. I don't think as an independent director I get to say I'm just on the board because I'm a lawyer. I will let the chairman do what he wants to do. I will have a quiet word with him, and if I don't think that's the right place, then I will step away. If I feel that there is something, I saw somebody in somebody's face or the way they spoke to me suggest that they're hiding something, I will actually go and probe a little bit further because I think it's my responsibility. So this whole Singaporean way of it's not my job, it's their responsibility, I completely disagree with that. I think it's everybody's role.
So there's something to be done in terms of disclosure requirements, something better in terms of.
Actually, if I could just, I'm sorry, if I could just follow on from what Stephanie was saying, I do agree that, I mean, it does start from the top, but I think it's become harder to define what good culture is from the top. I mean, if you think back to the 1980s and 1990s, it was all about maximizing shareholder value, and these days that just isn't enough. I mean, you need to look after all the other stakeholders and concern yourself with issues like the environment and climate change, inequality, and gender issues. So that leadership role is actually becoming much more difficult and much more complicated.
Andrew, do you agree with that? It's becoming more complicated, the responsibilities?
It is absolutely becoming more complicated. Couldn't agree with the panel more.
And your view on the tone at the top, does culture start with the chairman and the board? Yeah,
I think it certainly, it originates there because people look to the top for leadership, and that's where it tends to flow. So without that, it becomes very difficult to maintain integrity. But clearly that's just the start, right? You have to ensure that that is in place and that we walk the talk from the board to the senior management and down and down and down and across. And so that I think is absolutely essential. It is not one way either. And I think, again, at risk of pointing out the obvious, it becomes much more effective when it runs two-way. And one of the things that I think perhaps Singapore companies are historically not the best at is the appreciation that a more open organization, a more communicative organization, bilaterally across functions, up and down, actually makes for a stronger organization. Sometimes I feel that I think Singapore companies are too top-down, too one-way. Right? You tell us how to march and we will march, which is good in some circumstances. But when it comes to integrity and doing the right thing, I think that can actually be a detriment. So,
and how does CapitaLand practice?
It's again a flat organization in terms of integrity, right? No one is spared from their responsibilities in espousing the culture that we are trying to build at CapitaLand. Your whistleblowing channels, which are, I think, an important way to ensure that everyone has the ability to call to attention something that is going wrong. It has to be unfiltered, it has to be immediate, and has to be straight to the right person without any ability to circumvent that process. these are all sort of examples that you build in to encourage the fact that we are, again, trying to walk the talk as best we can, from all the way from the top to the person at the front line.
Do you think whistleblowing should be legislated, Andrew? It's currently in the code.
I think it's an important tool for companies to ensure that they have an effective framework to allow for integrity to be practiced, right? It's not, so if you need to legislate, I don't see why not. I wouldn't say that you would harm the process. I think there's a danger of over-prescripting what is needed. So as long as you put the right framework in place in terms of the whistleblowing policy that allows, as I said, this ability, regardless of where you are in the organization, if you see something that is wrong, that is being practiced, and you wish to call the attention to that behavior, you have the ability to do so. That, again, it's common sense. I don't know if you need to legislate the ability to do that.
We hear from June. June, from a regulator point of view, your views on whistleblowing. I know it's required in the code, everybody does it, it's disclosed, but do we need to legislate it?
We have proposed amendments to our rules on whistleblowing. So as I mentioned earlier about the consultation paper which closed, we would require companies, listed companies in the annual report to state how it has complied with best practices on whistleblowing. So in other words, the listed company would have to establish and as well as maintain a whistleblowing policy, and that would entail procedures, for the whistleblower to report on any misconduct. So apart from that, there should also be an independent function to look at the reports, especially if the reports are made in good faith and there's substantive evidence or sufficient evidence that is given by the whistleblower. So the rules go on to say that will also require that reports, in terms of the identity of the whistleblower, that should be kept confidential, and that the audit committee is responsible for oversight and monitoring of whistleblowing. So in terms of the rules, we would expect that to be codified once the consultation. We will provide the feedback as well as the timing in terms of the implementation.
Thanks, June. So when you say codified, this will be the main board listing rules?
Yeah, it will be both in the main board and the catalyst listing rules.
Okay.
In the section on annual report. Yeah, I'd like to also pick up the point that Thomas mentioned earlier, and that is in terms of, we all spoke about integrity, right? And you know that in order in terms of business integrity, you very often from our observations of companies that have breached our listing rules in the past, I realized that usually there's this failure in terms of escalation, right? So there's failure in terms of escalation of what are the problems in terms of the issues that are faced by management on the grounds in terms of dealing with their counterparts. So the day-to-day is very much left to the executive, right? And very often the board might be the last to know when there are lapses, in terms of the control. So I think one important area is to encourage, right, management and executive directors to escalate matters to the board. And that could also pertain to matters such as even corruption and bribery. If you are dealing with a business counterpart that offers you some form of gratification in order that the contract be awarded to the company, right? Such matters would have to be escalated. Otherwise, there's no way the management or executive directors can tap on the collective wisdom of the board. So I always see escalation as a very important area in terms of business integrity, as well as the problems on the grounds that are faced by management.
Thanks, June. Well, it's coming up to 15 minutes left to the panel. 2 hours has passed and gone by very, very quickly. What I'd like to do is to pose a last question to the panel. Take your time. what's your Christmas wish with regards to integrity that you would want to have for this year? We'll start with Stephanie, since you're wearing red, the Christmas colors. Then we go on to Thomas, Ben, June, Andrew, and then last but not least with Prof. Loh. What's your Christmas wish for this year with regards to integrity? Stephanie?
I'd like to see people walking rather than talking. I think there's a lot of talking and a lot of reporting and a lot of disclosing and a lot of copying other people's disclosures. That's a dirty little secret amongst listed companies. Let's just see what Capital N does and we'll change a few words, all right? I think it's more important that we walk it and be substantive about it. I think it's more important that we call out companies where there's a whistleblowing and it's not followed up with properly, where it's not rigorous. So let's go after the bad actors rather than try to make everybody do the same degree of compliance. Where in a COVID situation, small companies are going to be struggling. Rather than have more reports and more checklists to tick off, I would say let's go after the bad actors, because that's probably where our energy is best spent.
Stephanie, great Christmas wish. Santa Claus will be proud of you. Thomas?
Yeah, I think I hope some of the big issues on integrity can be resolved. I think one of it is, how do you choose your chief executives? How do you choose your chairman of the company? And most of the time is the guy who can give you the best returns on investments. And if you look at investments, so there's a mindset that I can have growth at all costs, profits at all costs mindset. And I hope that will change. Once that changes to not just making money, but how I make money is more important than things. So then only then can values and principles be set in. And the other point I think is that we need regulations. There is no such thing as absolutely no rules. But I think we need the right kind of regulations. The regulations that don't over-prescribe and do stop away, but also regulations that will tell you, will also give you the boundaries of and keep people within the right behavior. And eventually, I think in order to get good, in high integrity, you need companies to act responsibly and be inclusive, have stakeholder engagement, and be persistent. So you need persistence. And without persistence and determination, I don't think you will ever arrive. So my Christmas wish is the right people doing the right jobs with a right framework and a lot of determination, persistence, and eventually working together, because no company can on their own really succeed in this. And I think, okay, I have to sell a little bit of Koyo. One of the things that ASEAN CSR Network is trying to build is ASEAN Responsible and Inclusive Business Alliance, trying to get companies together. It's a bit of a challenge because people want to be seen to be good without trying to be really good. And I think we have to change that.
Thanks, Thomas. Ben, what's going to be your next article on your Christmas wish?
Well, just to follow on the point about whistleblowing and formalizing the process for whistleblowing, I think one of the other things that we should do is to relook the application of defamation laws when it relates to publicly listed companies, because that's when people realize what's going on, is when things get into the press. But a lot of things don't get into the press because of this fear of being sued for defamation in Singapore. That's a very real deterrent. So maybe that's something that we should look at. As for my Christmas wish, I think I agree with the other two panelists. I'm looking forward to everybody following the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, when it comes to, because it's just so hard to measure things like culture and integrity.
Yeah, so more disclosure doesn't necessarily mean good practices.
Absolutely, yeah.
Nice Christmas wish. In the Christmas spirit. Well done, Ben. June, what's your Christmas wish for this year?
Speaking from a regulator's perspective, if we look at this year, right, it is going to be very challenging. We will see a lot of the impact as companies start reporting their results for this financial year, especially those with 31st December financial year. And I would expect companies to feel the full brunt in terms of the challenges from COVID. So I'm actually on the same page as the rest of the panelists. For regulators, we want to make sure that companies do observe and comply with our rules, right? And the only way to do that is to give them more guidance. So if you look at 2020, there must be a reason for issuing regulators column to encourage companies as well as to set out our expectations on the disclosures that should be made during the COVID-19 in terms of the challenges. So don't take your investors by surprise. Be transparent about bad news. I can't help by emphasizing that. Be transparent about your bad financial performance and about your prospects. Be ready to change them when business situation turn bad, so that your share price will not suffer a significant decline when you break the bad news. So get your investors ready and be transparent.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, June, for making a list and checking it twice.
Thanks.
Andrew, your Christmas wish for integrity, anti-corruption, culture, trust.
It's a long list, Vinachan. June, thanks for the reminder. We will be responsible as we always try to be. I'm going to just take maybe a slightly backward step into the topic of sustainability, which I think some of us touched on earlier. And integrity and governance is obviously a key pillar of that. What I was very heartened to see this year, instead of concerns around companies pulling back on their sustainability efforts, given the issues with cash flow and profitability and so on and so forth, what we actually saw was both investors and other stakeholders and companies themselves actually doubling down on their sustainability efforts. And I was very heartened to see that. And my Christmas wish is that as much as we can generate a recovery out of the pandemic, that we not lose sight of what it is that we all believe is important. And that again is about stakeholders and a broader sense of what it means to be a sustainable organization in today's day and age. That would be my Christmas wish.
Good shout out, Andrew. Good shout out. And Prof. Loh, besides doing a follow-up study on this to close the gap, what's your Christmas wish for this year?
Okay, Christmas wish, based on what Andrew has said, he mentioned the word the recovery. So my Christmas wish is that Santa Claus will deliver a COVID-19 vaccine down the chimney to everyone on Earth. And then COVID-19 will come to a big grand ending on 31st December 2020. And so inspired by that, I was actually thinking, is there a vaccine for corporate corruption? Just like we thought about vaccine for. And I think actually, if you think hard, maybe disclosure is a good vaccine. In the sense that, of course, Stephanie might not agree. I think disclosure is not the end point, but a starting point. If you start disclosing, actually, after a while, you better, get walking. I mean, not just talking. I mean, to borrow a phrase on Stephanie. So I think when you disclose, when there's so much smoke, ultimately the fire will come out. So I think going forward, maybe I think with June, Ben Paul with the media, the power of the media, Thomas with power ASEAN, and of course Andrew Lin, you can build this whole entity of good disclosure through company involvement. We can develop a good vaccine for corporate corruption, and it starts with disclosure. Okay.
Well done, Prof. Well done. Well, we've come to the end of the panel. We've just got 5 more minutes. Panelists, any last remarks beyond this? We've got 5 more minutes. It's been a great discussion, fast and furious. If there are no more remarks from the panel, let me, on behalf of SIAS, thank you, panelists, for your 2 hours. Extremely good remarks. Very thoughtful. And I'm sure we can do a part 2 of this in the near future. With that, over back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Wan Chen, and to all of the panelists. My Christmas wish is that all of our panel discussions are as spirited and candid as the one that we've just observed. Thank you again for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again